Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a bowl from segmented ash rings and a section of birch cast in 3-colour epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing I did was cut the birch to size. This was done on the bandsaw. After slicing it in half, I drilled a hole to locate it on the circle cutting jig. Then it was a simple case of cutting a series of straight lines until it was roughly to shape. After a quick check to make sure it fits in the casting bucket, it was time to do the first casting. And this brings me on to this episode's sponsor, T-Expert. For full disclosure, they've supplied the epoxy resin for this project free of charge. Check out the video description for a 10% discount code and links to their website. The chosen colours were, as the title says, red, green and blue. These are the 3 primary colours of light, more commonly known as RGB. The colours were suggested in the comments of a previous video, and I was interested to see how they would look. Each batch was thoroughly mixed, then left to stand to pre-cure. I'm still learning with this new resin. Last time I got very close to leaving it too long, so I monitored it very closely, and I think I got it just right this time round. When pouring the resin, I tried to keep the colours in 3 separate places around the birch blank, but this resin is very viscous, which helps a lot with the colour separation, so I'll mix the top layer up a bit to hopefully get a more swirly pattern. Next I added some weight to stop the blank floating, and placed it in a pressure pot, added 50 to 55 psi and left it to cure in a warm room. It's the next day and time to cut the segments. This project required 3 rings, each containing 18 segments, so 54 in total. Then each segment needed to be sanded to remove the scraggy bits, and this time I decided to use the Triton sander. I'm not sure if it speeded up the process, but it was better than hand sanding. And that's enough of that. With the segments prepared, I could assemble the rings. First was the base section. Using a 3D printed template, I built up the first ring. The segments held in place with another 3D printed spacer. This has 2mm prongs on it, and when it's superglued in place, it keeps the joints a consistent size. Once the first side is glued up, the template has to be removed and another spacer added to lock the segments in place. The second white spacer has the prongs on one side only. This will be the underside of the base. second ring is assembled in the same way as the first, but after gluing the spacer to one side of the segments and removing the template, it's placed on the bench and the double-sided spacer on the first ring is then pressed into the open joints. And when both rings are lined up, superglue is dripped onto the sandwich spacer and accelerator is sprayed in to activate the glue. To finish the base assembly, I added a solid piece of sapele to the central void. This had been turned down to allow for a decent border of epoxy, which I could later expose in the finished piece. The segmented ring for the rim was next, more or less the same as before, but only one ring was required, and it was made with wider segments to give a 25mm overhang over the feature midsection. With both assemblies finished, I got each one ready for casting, and it was time to check on the feature midsection in the pressure pot. It's been about 1 week since I cast this piece, and in that time the pot has lost around half its initial pressure, which isn't too bad. Anyway, with the casting removed, all was well. There was a bit of shrinkage on the edge over the high points of the birch, but most important, there were no cracks and no voids. So I put it to one side, and I'll come back to it later. I wasn't sure how much resin to mix, so for a start I did 2 batches mixed with black mica powder. These were then poured into the base casting, and it only just filled it, so I had to mix another for the rim casting. Quick reminder of today's sponsor, and it was on to the final casting. I figured this would only require 1 batch, again mixed with black mica powder. A couple of minutes mixing later, I poured it into the mould. No need to pre-cure these last castings, as it's just one colour. All topped up, they both went into the pressure pot, 50 to 55 psi added, and they were left to cure. It's the next day, and with both castings out of the pot and removed from their moulds, I was happy to see a successful result. Once again, no cracks and no voids, and most importantly, no sign of overheating. All 3 castings needed to be levelled. I could have done this on the lathe, but I opted to do it on the drum sander. Each casting had 1 level flat side, so that was a good place to start. First up, the tallest midsection. This was followed by the base, and then the rim. After marking the centre on the base and the midsection, I drilled a couple of holes and moved over to the lathe. The first thing I needed to do was bond the two pieces together. For this I used rapid setting epoxy mixed with black mica powder. I spread the epoxy over the base and offered it up to the midsection. Using the previously marked centre point to get it lined up, I applied pressure with a tailstock. This was then left for 30 minutes to cure. It's 30 minutes later and the epoxy is cured, so I could get on with turning. For a start, I had to remove the excess resin covering the base segments. I did this so I could check the joint between the segmented rings to make sure it's parallel to the base. I've had problems before with misalignment, but this time all was well, so I continued removing the waste material. So with the segments fully exposed, I moved on to removing the epoxy over the birch in the midsection. For this I used the full-size carbide with a negative rake cutter. In general, this cutter is much kinder to the resin, cutting ribbons of material, unlike standard cutters that chip and shatter the surface. And with the midsection cleaned up, I could see a shape beginning to appear, so I moved on to roughing out the pedestal. This was done with a 3/8 bowl gouge, working on either side of the cut, using the joint between the segments as a centre point. I cut into the base, steadily shaping the cutout. I didn't intend to complete the cutout at this stage, so after a final cut I moved back to the midsection to try something different. To sharpen my bowl gouges, I recently switched back to a Tormek with a 600 grit diamond wheel, and the results have been very impressive. So much so that I decided to try a light cut across the midsection. I'm glad I gave it a go. The birch did have some tear out from the carbide cutter, but after a pass with a gouge it was completely gone, though it was a compromise. The surface of the resin was left with a few ridges. After another light pass riding the bevel on the gouge, I was able to cut a lot of it away, but it would need the large negative rake scraper to completely smooth it out. Happy the outside was roughly heading in the right direction, I moved on to cutting the mortise in the base. The underside was nice and flat from the drum sander, but I hollowed it out slightly so the finished piece would sit on the edge of the base. This was followed by the parting tool, cutting in around 8mm, 5/16 of an inch. Next I cleaned the inner bit out with a gouge, cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, pulled the tailstock clear and finished the recess and added some embellishment. Then I sanded to 800 grit and added a finish, topped off with finishing wax. Mortise done, I glued on the rim. For this I used more rapid setting epoxy with black mica powder, adding an evenish layer around the edge of the main blank. This was sat on the rim using a previously marked circle to centre it. After making sure the segments in the base and the rim lined up, I mixed a bit more epoxy and repaired a void between the two pieces. After a cup of coffee, I refixed the workpiece to the lathe and set about hollowing out. The rim needed to be opened up to get to the midsection underneath, and the bowl gouge seemed to be the best choice to cut through the segments. Once I could see the resin midsection, I switched to the mid-sized carbide. This is a standard cutter and it rips into the waste material, tearing out ribbons of resin to expose the birch underneath. At this point I'd gone as deep as the mid-sized carbide could reach, so I switched over to a medium-sized hook tool. This is a 10mm high-speed steel tip, and it was great for getting into the base of the bowl. The hook tool was very efficient at removing the waste, but it left tiny ridges in the surface. I'm sure with a bit more practice with this tool I could get rid of them, but I needed to move on, so I used the full-size carbide to smooth things out and get closer to the finished shape. The inside was now very close to being done, but before I cut away the centre support, I turned my attention to the outside. Beginning with the rim, I removed the resin covering the segments and then set about creating the sweeping undercut down into the midsection. The profile of the rim was heading in the right direction, so I began refining the shape of the midsection. For this I used a negative rate carbide cutter to shave off thin layers, making sure I wasn't creating any tear out in the process. The edge of the rim needed a bit more work to remove the excess resin. Then I moved on to the base, making the cutout a bit deeper, though I still wasn't ready to cut all the way through to expose the black resin around the core. The base was too wide, so that was the next thing to be done. Using the bowl gouge, I shear scraped the edge, reducing the diameter. It's hard to explain the ideal size, I just stop when it looks right. And having cut away the edge, it was now too thick, so using the bowl gouge this was reduced, and the shape was refined a bit more, I still had some more work to do to finish the cutout, but it was getting late and I wanted to repair a void before calling it a day. You can just about make out the void in the black section of the resin. Before filling it, I used a mid-sized carbide to blend the joint between the rim and the midsection. Then I mixed some epoxy resin with red mica powder and filled the hole. Repair done, it was left overnight to cure. It's the next day, the repair has worked, so I cleaned it up with a light cut from a freshly sharpened bowl gouge, taking the opportunity to do another pass over the midsection whilst I was there. The outside was mostly done, so I set about exposing the black resin in the cutout. Using the 1/4" parting tool, I slowly cut away the segments. I didn't want to go in too far, just enough so there was a clean transition between the resin and the segmented rings. I refined the profile of the cutout, blending and fairing the upper and lower cuts with a bowl gouge and skew chisel, being careful not to take too much off, especially where the base met the midsection. I wanted the pinch midsection to stand out as much as possible. Few light passes with the negative rate scrapers and the outside was done. I sanded with 80 grit to check for tool marks, then I went back to finish the inside. The central support was removed. I was going to whittle it away until it fell off, but access was difficult, so I resorted to snapping it off by hand. With that out of the way, I cleaned up the base to reveal the sapele I'd cast in the segmented rings. Using the carbide and the small negative rate scraper, I continued blending and fairing the inner surface, removing any high spots. The sidewall thickness was where I wanted it at around 10mm 3/8 of an inch thick, so there wasn't much to do. Came out to tidy up the rim, and after a final pass with a negative rate scraper, it was done. Then I sanded both inside and out from 80 to 3000 grit. Then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed by 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First to go is Mirka Polar Shine 10, a single coat, cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. That's it, another project finished, and I'm really happy with this one, and I hope you like it too. The separation between the 3 colours looks great, the birch and the ash segments sit well together, and the resin in the midsection has a crisp line between it and the wood, which contrasts against the segmented rings where the black resin has bled into the ash end grain. Anyway, with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.